Hello everyone, this is Chess Teacher Tui, and I am going to start a video series on Mark Dvorsky's Endgame manual. This is considered by many to be the modern endgame masterpiece, and for many people who wish to learn chess, this is one of the key books to learn. I also want to recommend, for studying endgame, Silman's Complete Endgame course from beginning to master. That is a book that is structured according to difficulty level, but when it comes to chess expertise and chess teaching, there is no better chess teacher, at least for strong players, than Mark Dvorsky. So what we're going to look at today in this first video is, in endgames, this idea of key squares. Now, this video we're going to do today, if you've seen me do endgame things before, this might be a little bit more challenging. I'm going to start trying to introduce more challenging material and then work through Dvorsky's Endgame manual. So in this particular video, we're going to look at the concept of key squares. When you look at the drawing that you have, this is a screenshot of a PDF of Dvorsky's Endgame manual, which I purchased. This particular position is showing the key squares when white has a pawn on the fourth rank. So in this position, and of course you can always flip it, so if it were black, black would have a pawn on the fifth rank. The key squares in this position are the squares that are marked with the X. You see that there is an X on the squares of C6, D6, and E6. And in these key squares, if we scroll up, we see Dvorsky's definition for what a key square is. Key squares are what we call those squares whose occupation by the king assures victory, regardless of whose turn it is to move. And this idea of key squares, when it comes to the king and pawns endgame, is particularly important when we look at this puzzle position that Dvorsky provides just a little bit later in the chapter. So in this position, we see that we have a king on d1, and the opposite king is on f8. And we know that with the pawn on the fourth rank, if our king can get to either of these three squares, either a6, b6, or c6, then white can win, regardless of whose turn it is to move. But how to get there? One mistake a novice might make is to try to run the pawn right away. So let's see what happens if white tries to run the pawn immediately. So let's say instead of getting the king at the pawn, white plays b5. Well, the black king immediately starts coming over. And at this point you realize if you play b7, black plays c7, and the pawn will be caught. So that doesn't work. And even if you change your strategy, let's say you realize, oh, the pawn will be caught. And so the king starts coming up. And now the king has effectively gotten in front of the pawn, and because of that, black will be able to draw. So running the pawn is not an option. So if you can't run the pawn, and you know you have to get the king in front of the pawn, and that's a key idea. If the pawn is not in a position where it can run on its own, where it's not quote-unquote outside where the opposing king is not outside the square, then the idea has to be to get the king in front of the pawn and to one of Dvorsky's three squares, a6, b6, and c6 here. So the first move, of course, has got to be king c2. Makes sense that black would play king e7, king b3, king d6, and here is one of the key moments of the position. And in this key moment of the position, white has to make a decision to go to one of those two squares. He has to go to either a4 or c4. And the key move, the right square, is a4, but let's begin to see why c4 is not correct. If c4 comes here, now black can draw. We'll just click on the computer to show that I'm not lying. See, it evaluates it at 0. Because now black can gain the opposition. Now, the opposition, for those of you who may not remember, the opposition is when the kings are one square apart, and if it is not your turn to move, then you have the opposition. And that is what you usually want in these endgames. You want the opposition. By black taking the opposition, it is now going to be impossible for the king to be able to get in front of the pawn or get into the key squares where it can be win. Just to show how this plays out, 5 check. And regardless of which way the king tries to go, the king, by matching the other king's movements, shadowing it and gaining opposition, now it was in a position where black draws because it is now a stalemate. So let's go back, and we see once again this critical position. And the real move needs to be king a4. Why? Well, as you can see, what will happen is black will play king to c6, nothing surprising there, king to a5, and now what we see is that in order for black to keep white off of this key square, a6, he has to play king to b7. And that's to try to keep him off of one of these 3 key squares. But then white is able to move in front of his pawn, and now white has the opposition. Because white has the opposition, black has no choice. He can no longer move to one of these 3 squares, so he has to move either to the side and or back. If he moves to the side, then white moves to one of the 3 key squares, and white can win. How would he win? Well, it would look something like this. So it's black to move. He can either go back or he can move forward. So we'll just say he moves forward. Check. He's not going to move back. Now the king steps up, and now the king controls the queening square. And here you have to be careful, because black has tried a pretty clever trick here. This is a trick that you can do with white pawns. If you're playing just a little bit carelessly, you might accidentally draw here. So what you need to do instead of pushing the pawn up is you actually need to bring the king back. Because if you don't bring the king back, if you push the pawn up, you've just accidentally created a draw. Black now has no legal moves. So you actually move the king back, forces the king back again, and here you just check. He comes up, and because the king is on one of these key squares, he still wins, because even though you push, because it is still black to move, the king has to come down, and then the king moves up again and controls the queening square, and mate will quickly follow after the promotion. So that's the key. The key idea is that in this initial position, as we look all the way back, is to get to one of these key squares. And by going around the pawn rather than going the shortest view, he can exploit the time and then get to one of those key squares. And I'm really glad that we could look at this potential position where, if the king is smart, he comes up, and tries to force us into this position. Now, what happens instead if you check here instead? Well, that could be a problem. Once again, you have to be careful, because if you go up now with the king, it's a draw. So what are you going to do? But if you check and you go here, now all of a sudden, oh no, it's a draw again. What is the king going to do? He's just given it away. So in this position, even though this does give the potential draw, the important thing is to understand how to come back. And it's also important not to go back this way, because now all of a sudden black has the opposition. So even though the king is in front of the pawn, the fact that he has the opposition makes it more difficult. Now, it's still a win, and I want to be clear that because you're on the key square, it's still a win. Why? Well, because even though he has the opposition. Because the king is still on one of the key squares, black is still forced to vacate, and white will still promote. But it's still good and worthwhile to look at the dynamics of this. So, when you have a pawn on the fourth rank, if you can get your king to one of these three squares, one of those three squares in front of or on either side of the pawn on that sixth rank, then no matter where the opponent's king is or who it is to move, as long as you can keep that pawn defended, it is a win for white. So that is the kind of this explanation of key squares. This is Chess Teacher Tui, and I hope you have a great day.